When a frightened little girl runs to a garbage man for help, a quiet morning turns into a race against time to save her mother from a dangerous man. If you enjoyed this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to support more thrilling and emotional tales like this one. Jake had always been an early riser. His job as a garbage collector wasn't glamorous, but he took pride in it. "I don't just pick up trash, I help keep the city clean and safe," he often told himself. That morning was like any other. He drove his garbage truck through Maplewood Lane, a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people walked their dogs, kids played on their front lawns, and families waved to each other as they sipped their morning coffee. Jake followed his usual routine: stop the truck, lift the bins, dump the trash, and move to the next house. But just as he was about to grab another bin, he heard something unusual: the sound of small, hurried footsteps. He turned around just in time to see a little girl running toward him. She looked no older than 10, barefoot, her nightgown dirty and torn. Her face was streaked with tears, and she was trembling. "Help me," she sobbed, clutching at Jake's arm. Jake immediately dropped what he was doing and knelt down to her level. Hey, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" The girl was gasping for breath, her tiny fists clenched tightly. He locked my mom in the basement." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Who locked her in?" The girl turned and pointed to a white house at the end of the street. It looked like any other house in the neighborhood: neatly trimmed lawn, flower pots on the porch, curtains drawn shut. But now that Jake was looking at it closely, something felt off. He placed his hands gently on the girl's shoulders. "Okay, slow down. What's your name?" "Emily," she sniffled. "Please, you have to help her." Jake's mind raced. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a hero. He was just a garbage man. But he couldn't just walk away. Then, something caught his eye. Behind the window of the White House, a shadow moved. Someone inside was watching them. Jake's pulse quickened. He didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear: Emily and her mother were in serious danger. His hand went to his pocket, fingers fumbling for his phone. He needed to call 911. Fast. Jake's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone. He quickly dialed 911 and pressed it to his ear. "911, what's your emergency?" a calm voice asked. "There's a little girl, Emily, she just ran up to me, crying," Jake said, glancing at her as she clung to his side. "She says someone locked her mom in the basement of a house on Maplewood Lane." The dispatcher's tone changed instantly. "Are you in immediate danger?" Jake looked back at the house. The shadow behind the curtain was gone. Someone was inside, listening. Watching. I don't know," he admitted. "But something's not right." "Stay put. Officers are on the way," the dispatcher instructed. Jake turned back to Emily. "Do you know who locked your mom in?" She hesitated, her lip trembling. "It's my mom's boyfriend, Dan. He's really mean. He hits her when he's mad." Jake clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what made him angrier: the fact that a man had done this or the fact that a little girl had to witness it. Then, the front door of the house creaked open. Jake's breath caught in his throat as a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. His eyes were cold and calculating as he looked directly at Jake and Emily. "Hey," the man called out. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Emily whimpered and clutched Jake's hand tighter. Jake squared his shoulders, trying to hide his fear. "Just doing my job, sir." The man smirked, taking a step closer. "That so?" Jake saw bruises on the man's knuckles. His gut told him, this was Dan. And Dan knew something was wrong. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to echo. Dan's expression changed. His eyes flicked toward the sound. And then he bolted back inside. Jake's heart pounded. He's going to do something. Emily, stay behind me, he whispered. And then, the front door slammed shut. The sirens grew louder, echoing through the neighborhood. Emily tightened her grip on Jake's hand, her small body trembling. Dan had run back inside the house, and that terrified Jake more than anything. He didn't know what the man was planning, but it couldn't be good. Jake turned to Emily. Listen, sweetheart, the police are almost here. You're safe now. She nodded, wiping her tears, but her gaze was locked on the house. What if he hurts her before they get in? Jake swallowed hard. It was a real possibility. He glanced at the door, debating for a moment, should he go in? Before he could decide, 2 police cars screeched to a stop in front of the house. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn. Where is he? One officer demanded, approaching Jake. Jake pointed at the house. Dan. He's inside. Emily says her mom is locked in the basement. The officer nodded sharply. Stay back. A second officer took Emily by the hand and led her away. We've got you, sweetheart. You're safe now. Then, everything happened at once. As the first officer stepped toward the house, a loud bang echoed from inside. Jake's heart stopped. A gunshot. Emily screamed. The officers rushed toward the door, kicking it open. Jake watched helplessly as they disappeared inside, shouting commands. Seconds felt like hours. Then, another gunshot. To be continued. I'll now write part 4 where the police storm the house and uncover the horrifying truth. Stay tuned. The second gunshot sent a wave of panic through Jake. Was someone hurt? He wanted to rush in, but he knew he had to stay back. Emily sobbed beside him, clutching the arm of the officer who had taken her away from the house. Mommy, she cried. Inside the house, the officer's shouts echoed through the halls. Put the gun down. Now. Jake held his breath. Silence. Then, a scuffle. Heavy footsteps. A loud crash. And finally, a third gunshot. Jake's stomach twisted. Had they stopped him? Or had he hurt someone else? Seconds later, 2 officers emerged from the house. One was gripping Dan's arms, forcing him forward in handcuffs. His face was twisted with rage. You have no idea what you just ruined. Dan spat, struggling against them. Jake exhaled in relief, they had him. Then another officer came out, carrying something that made Jake's blood run cold. A rifle. Dan had been armed. If the police had been even a second slower, someone could have died. Emily whimpered. Where's my mom? Jake turned, watching the door. A final officer stepped out, supporting a woman, bruised, pale, but alive. Mommy. Emily broke free and sprinted toward her. Tears filled the woman's eyes as she dropped to her knees, pulling Emily into the tightest hug imaginable. Jake felt his own eyes sting. They were safe. The officer turned to Jake. She was locked in the basement, just like Emily said. He was planning to run. Maybe worse. Jake clenched his fists. He didn't want to think about what worse could have meant. Emily's mother looked up at him, eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Jake shook his head. She's the brave one, he said, nodding at Emily. She saved you. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her daughter tighter. Jake finally let out the breath he had been holding. The nightmare was over. The flashing red and blue lights cast long shadows across Maplewood Lane. Neighbors had gathered, whispering amongst themselves, watching as Dan was shoved into the back of a police car. Jake stood back, hands on his hips, exhaling deeply. It was finally over. Emily and her mother, Sarah, sat on the steps of their house, wrapped in a blanket given by one of the officers. Emily refused to let go of her mother's hand, as if afraid she'd disappear again. A female officer approached Jake, giving him a knowing look. "You saved them." Jake shook his head. "Emily saved her mom. I just made the call." The officer smirked. "Most people wouldn't have even done that. You did more than you know." Jake glanced at Emily. She caught his eye and gave him a small, tired smile. "Jake." He turned as his boss, Mr. Reynolds, jogged toward him. "What the hell happened?" Jake let out a short laugh. "It's a long story." Mr. Reynolds patted his shoulder. "Well, you're gonna be all over the news, that's for sure. Garbage man turns hero." Jake groaned. That was the last thing he wanted. He didn't do this for attention. The female officer chuckled. "Whether you like it or not, people are gonna hear about this." Sarah stood up slowly, walking toward Jake. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice still shaking. "If you hadn't been here, I don't know what would have happened." Jake nodded. "Just, take care of her." Sarah smiled down at Emily, brushing her hair back. "Always." Emily suddenly ran forward and hugged Jake tightly. Jake stiffened for a moment, surprised, then gently hugged her back. "You're my hero," she whispered. For the first time that night, Jake let himself smile. Maybe he was just a garbage man. But to Emily, he was something more. And that was all that mattered. After the dramatic rescue, Jake went back to his routine. But every time he passed the White House, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Despite Dan being arrested, Jake couldn't help but wonder how deep the darkness ran in that house. One afternoon, as Jake was finishing his route, he overheard some neighbors talking about Sarah and her mysterious past. Whispers about domestic violence had always been hidden behind closed doors. However, no one seemed to know the full story of how Dan entered the picture. Jake paused, considering. He wasn't sure why he felt the urge to learn more, but something about the situation felt unfinished. His curiosity got the best of him, and after work, he drove back to the house. He wanted to check on Emily and her mother, make sure they were doing okay, and perhaps find out what had been going on before Dan. But when he arrived, the house was quiet. No one answered the door. Just as he was about to leave, Emily's voice called from the side gate. "Jake! You came back." Emily smiled when she saw Jake, but her face immediately darkened. "My mom isn't feeling well. She's inside resting," she said, glancing nervously toward the house. Jake nodded. "I just wanted to check in. Make sure everything was okay." Emily's eyes shifted to the ground. "Mom told me not to talk about things with anyone. She's scared Dan might come back." Jake crouched down to her level. "I understand. But you know you can trust me, right?" Emily nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. I remember things. Things about Dan. Things I don't think Mom knows I remember." Jake's heart tightened. "What kind of things, Emily?" She hesitated again, looking over her shoulder to make sure her mother wasn't watching. Then she whispered, "There were other people who came to the house. I remember them talking. Dan wasn't alone. There were men with him, and they were mean." Jake's blood ran cold. He had suspected there was more to the story than he knew. As the days passed, Jake couldn't get Emily's words out of his head. There were men with him, what did that mean? Was there more to Dan's crime than just domestic violence? He decided to go back to the house again, hoping to get some answers. This time, Sarah opened the door. She looked tired but relieved to see him. "Jake, thank you for checking on us again. You've done more than enough already." Jake smiled but his mind was elsewhere. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Emily's been talking, and Sarah stiffened. Talking about what? Jake hesitated. She said she remembered other men at the house. Is there something you need to tell me? Sarah's face paled. I don't know what she remembers. I thought I had kept her away from it all. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. Jake, there are things I didn't want her to know, things I never wanted anyone to know. Jake's heart raced. Sarah, please. What's going on? Sarah stepped back into the house, gesturing for him to follow. Come inside. I think it's time you knew the full story. Inside, Sarah led Jake to the basement door. Dan wasn't just a criminal. He was part of something much darker. He was involved in something I didn't even realize until it was too late. She paused, her voice trembling. I didn't know how deep it went. But Dan wasn't just abusing me. He was using me, using my house for things I never imagined. Drugs, weapons, illegal activities. Jake felt sick to his stomach. You mean, he was running a criminal operation from here? Sarah nodded, her eyes downcast. I didn't know until it was too late. He brought dangerous people here. And when I tried to get out, I didn't realize how bad it was going to get. She motioned toward the basement. The worst part is, I think they hid something down there. I think it's still there. Jake knew there was no turning back now. Whatever was in that basement could be the key to understanding Dan's full plan and the men he was working with. He needed to see it for himself. Together, Sarah, Emily, and Jake headed to the basement. As they descended the creaky wooden steps, a damp smell filled the air. The basement was dark, cold, and filled with old furniture, but there was something in the corner that caught Jake's eye. A small wooden chest. Is that? Jake began, his voice trailing off. Sarah nodded. I don't know what's inside, but I've always felt that something was hidden there. I think it's more than just money or drugs. Jake opened the chest cautiously. What he saw inside made his heart race: documents, photos, and a stack of old, faded passports. Those men. Dan was working with people from all over the world, Jake whispered. This wasn't just a local crime ring. Suddenly, a noise came from behind them. Jake spun around, his eyes widening in horror. A figure stepped into the basement, the same shadow he had seen weeks before. The confrontation was far from over. Jake's heart raced as the figure stepped further into the basement. The same shadowy man who had been watching them from the window of the White House just days ago now stood before them. His presence was chilling, and Jake instinctively moved in front of Emily and Sarah, his body tensing for a fight. Who the hell are you? Jake demanded, his voice steady despite the fear swirling in his stomach. The man smiled coldly. You don't know who you're messing with, garbage man. You think you can just walk in here and uncover what you don't understand? His voice was laced with menace. Jake's instincts screamed at him to act fast. The man had an air of authority, and Jake knew from the intensity in his eyes that he wasn't alone in this. It was clear, this was part of something bigger. Sarah gasped behind him, her face going pale as she recognized the man. It's him, it's one of Dan's associates. I've seen him before, with Dan. He's dangerous. Jake tried to keep his composure, but a chill ran down his spine. What do you want? Why are you here? He demanded, his fists clenched. He had to keep Emily and Sarah safe. The man laughed softly, a cruel sound that echoed in the basement. I was hoping you wouldn't find that box. But now, since you have. He paused, eyeing the chest Jake had just opened. There's only one way to make sure you don't leave this basement alive. Before Jake could react, the man lunged toward him with lightning speed. A sharp object flashed in the dim light, a knife. Without thinking, Jake grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it with all his strength, catching the man's wrist and forcing him to drop the knife. The figure grunted in pain, but he was quick, moving to grab another weapon from his jacket pocket. Jake could see the man was no ordinary thug. This was someone who was trained to fight. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. Emily screamed from behind him, and that scream fueled Jake's anger. With one last, desperate effort, Jake swung the pipe again, knocking the man backward, sending him crashing into a stack of crates. The figure groaned but managed to stand, his eyes now filled with rage. "You'll regret this," he snarled, before turning and bolting for the basement door. "Don't let him get away," Jake shouted to Sarah. But Sarah, pale and shaking, just stared at the man, her face full of fear. "Jake, we need to leave. We need to go. This isn't over." With the man gone, Sarah locked the basement door behind them, but it was clear to Jake that they couldn't stay in the house anymore. The danger had just escalated, they had now uncovered something much bigger than Dan. As Sarah and Emily followed him out of the house, Jake's mind raced. He had never imagined that something as simple as a garbage route would lead him into such a deadly web of crime. The man in the basement wasn't just a thug, he was part of an international criminal network, and if they had discovered one secret, who knew how many more were hidden in plain sight. "We need to go to the police," Jake said firmly, glancing at Sarah. "Now. Before they come back." Sarah nodded, but Jake could see the hesitation in her eyes. "I don't know if they can help us, Jake. The people involved, they have connections. Powerful ones." But Jake wasn't about to let fear dictate their next steps. This wasn't just about protecting Emily and Sarah anymore, it was about stopping something bigger, something that could destroy more lives if left unchecked. As they drove away from the house, the police station loomed ahead. Jake had already called them to report the man, but after what had just happened, he knew they couldn't afford to trust anyone without verifying their loyalty. But before they could reach the station, another car pulled up alongside them, a sleek black SUV. It was too well timed. The man from the basement must have called for reinforcements. The car swerved, blocking their path. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice urgent. "Get down, now." Suddenly, the car door opened, and two men dressed in black suits stepped out, both of them heavily armed. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't going to end well. Without hesitation, Jake slammed on the gas, swerving past the SUV. The men didn't chase them immediately, but Jake knew they wouldn't give up. They couldn't outrun them forever. His mind raced. They needed to get to the police station, but he also had to protect Emily and Sarah. The stakes were higher than ever. "Stay low, and don't make a sound," Jake instructed, his voice grim. As he drove. If you enjoyed this thrilling story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-pounding tales of courage and suspense.